Of course, it's important to do mitzvahs. But you know what's more important? To do mitzvahs with tremendous enthusiasm, or as the Mishnah describes it, Ben Azai says we should run to do a mitzvah. Let's have a look. It's in the Pirkei Avos of this week, the 4th chapter. Ben Azai taught, Haverotz mitzvah kala, you should run to do a mitzvah that is a light or less important mitzvah, or vorech minhu avera, and you should also flee from an avera. So this lesson, which is obviously part of the lessons of Pirkei Avos, which are lessons in how to live beyond the requirements of the law, is Ben Azai's intention is not to tell us that you should keep even the mitzvahs that people consider to be less important. And he's not telling us that you should avoid doing an avera. The fact that you should do all mitzvahs and that you should avoid averas is self-evident. Goes without saying that every Jewish person should keep all of the mitzvahs regardless of how important you feel they might be. And it goes without saying that a Jew may not transgress an avera, even if it might be something that a person considers to be a lesser avera. That's not Ben Azai's message. So what is his message? Now the Hayrof in Ben Azai is in the Oifen von Kiyam HaMitzvahs. Ben Azai is not telling us to keep mitzvahs, he's telling us how to approach keeping mitzvahs. That there should be running and enthusiasm and urgency to do a mitzvah, or and fleeing from an avera as if it was a real threat. In other words, it's saying not only should you do the mitzvah, but you should run with enthusiasm to do even a mitzvah that people might consider to be less important. And not only should a person avoid transgressions, but you've got to run for your life when there's a transgression on the horizon. So what we do need to understand though is in this principle, as a mitzvah that a person should run to do a mitzvah, actually is not only something that appears in Pirkei Avos as higher grade Judaism or living beyond the letter of the law. No, it's actually brought in practical black and white Judaism in the Shulchan Aruch, which says mitzvah lorutz, that there's a mitzvah to run when you go to shul. And then the Shulchan Aruch expands it out, and the same applies to every mitzvah. So what's Ben Azai telling us that is beyond halacha? Halacha says you have to run to do mitzvahs. And Avos is the uftu from the Maimer, Haverotz mitzvah chulei. So what is the innovation of Ben Azai is that you should run to do a mitzvah? Als midas chasidus, that falls into the category of something which is special Judaism, beyond the letter of the law. Pshasachiv min hadin mitzvah, if it is within the law. That's question number one. And we also have to understand an interesting nuance about Ben Azai's statement. Favos Ben Azai is nit Messiah, why it is that Ben Azai does not conclude his statement about running to do a mitzvah that is a so-called lighter mitzvah. Why doesn't he conclude it by saying that you should run to do a mitzvah that is a smaller mitzvah with the same enthusiasm that you would run to do a mitzvah that is a major mitzvah? Because actually that would seem to make sense in context. And in fact it's language that we already see in a previous Mishnah in this parak, about how scrupulous a person should be about a mitzvah, that you should be as scrupulous around doing a mitzvah that is a lesser mitzvah or a smaller mitzvah as you would over a serious mitzvah. So why doesn't Ben Azai do the same thing here? Say, be as enthusiastic for the minor mitzvahs as you are for the major mitzvahs. Now, under a Zayin Takagura, der Mishnah, the word Kevachamura, there are versions of this Mishnah that do actually include that word Kevachamura. But the Alter Rebbe B'Siddur is as nit Geiros. The Alter Rebbe does not go with that version in his Pirkei Avos and his Siddur. And that's actually true for most of the commentators on the Pirkei Avos. They also don't use that word Kevachamura. The question is, why? So Muzman Zogan, so therefore we're going to have to conclude, as that although when we're considering how scrupulous a person has to be about keeping mitzvahs, there it is appropriate to say, be scrupulous in a minor mitzvah, exactly like in a major mitzvah. Yet when we describe running with enthusiasm to perform a mitzvah, is a mitzvah kala nit gleich zu mitzvah chamura. Actually would seem from Ben Azai's omission, it would seem that running to do a minor mitzvah is not identical to running to do a major mitzvah. And therefore all Ben Azai says is, be enthusiastic and run to do a minor mitzvah. that you have to also have enthusiasm to do so-called minor mitzvahs. Und von dem lernt man, als man darf laufen mit noch aggressor Ritze zu einer Mitzvah Chamura. But actually we'd extrapolate out of that if you have to be enthusiastic and run to do a minor mitzvah, you certainly have to run with even greater enthusiasm to do a major mitzvah. So es bleibt aber nicht verständig, but what we still don't understand is this. Favos darf Ben Azai v'chlal moisef seine Mitzvah kala. Why does Ben Azai have to tell us that you should run to do a mitzvah that is a minor mitzvah? Surely it would have made much more sense if Ben Azai just made a broader statement, run with enthusiasm to do mitzvahs. Was meint jede Mitzvah von allen Mitzvahs, which of course would include every kind of mitzvah. And if it's true that Ben Azai is effectively telling us you've got to run to a small mitzvah, and the implication is you've got to run even more so to a great mitzvah. Well, if Ben Azai had just kept it generic and said run to do mitzvahs, we would have realized that you should be enthusiastic about every mitzvah, and we could appreciate that the more important the mitzvah, the more enthusiastic you're expected to be. Seeing as Ben Azai hasn't made the case that you have to be as enthusiastic about a minor mitzvah as a major mitzvah, that implies that there are different grades of mitzvah. So just tell us broadly, be enthusiastic about mitzvahs, and everybody will understand how to approach different mitzvahs differently. Okay. The time of the mitzvah kala barech min ha'avera. So then Ben Azai doesn't just leave us with a statement. He actually motivates why we should be running to do mitzvahs and fleeing from averas, and he gives two explanations. So Zogt Ben Azai in dem zwei inyanim. He says two things. First he tells us she mitzvah gereres mitzvah v'avera gereres avera. First thing he tells us is that the nature of mitzvahs is that they compound. So if you run with enthusiasm to do a minor mitzvah, it will lead to another, to another, to another. And likewise with an avera, you've got to get away from an avera with absolute urgency, because one avera will lead to another. So that's the motivation. And then in addition to that base, he tells us schar mitzvah mitzvah schar avera avera, that the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah and the reward of an avera is an avera. Now those are two very similar but actually completely different lessons, and we need to understand the difference. So Viman Lent and Pashtus, so at face value, is the chiluk zwischen die zwei Timing, the distinction between these two different views is, or two different reasons. The erste time is masber favose darf laufen ton afila mitzvah kala. When we talk about mitzvah leads to mitzvah leads to mitzvah, that would explain the logic of why you should be running to do a mitzvah even if it is a minor mitzvah, because it's okay, it will compound, it will create a habit. So it doesn't matter that this mitzvah is a minor mitzvah, it will be a catalyst for many, many other mitzvahs. Run and do it as soon as possible. On the zweite Tam to Toif, and the perspective we get from the second reason that there's a reward for a mitzvah, which is the mitzvah, that tells us as die Ritz in a mitzvah, darf eich sein mitzvah der mitzvah gufa. That tells us that there's a value in running to do the minor mitzvah, even in and of itself. In other words, not only because it will be a catalyst to more mitzvahs in the future, but there's a reward for the mitzvah itself. Warum schar mitzvah mitzvah? Where the Bartanura Tarich as the schar v'hano was the mensch hot beim Tona mitzvah. So the Bartanura makes a very interesting observation. What does it mean that the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah? There's a certain satisfaction that a person gets from doing a mitzvah, certain pleasure. Was das drückt sich aus in sein Laufen Tona mitzvah, the fact that the person has that joy and enjoyment and satisfaction from the mitzvah will be reflected in the fact that, look, I'm running to do it. Obviously, I run to do something that I appreciate and enjoy. So, that enthusiasm is also a mitzvah. So in other words, it's not just that the mitzvah will bring value because it will cause other mitzvahs. The fact that there's a mitzvah, which I'm doing, and that mitzvah is done with enthusiasm, that is already in itself a greater mitzvah. Oder, wie der Pirish as the schar from mitzvah is a mitzvah, or the Pirish which is actually brought in the Medrash Shmuel, but it's taught a lot in Chassidus, that the reward of the mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. Die tzavse v'chibur mit neibischen was veret durch der mitzvah. I don't need a mitzvah to produce an external or subsequent reward, because the mitzvah creates attachment between me and Hashem, and that is the greatest reward that there could possibly be. So if I'm going to look at one mitzvah leading to another, and that's why you should run to do a minor mitzvah, what you're saying is this mitzvah will have value in the future because it will produce more mitzvahs. If I say schar mitzvah mitzvah, I'm saying the mitzvah, even though it is a minor mitzvah, has intrinsic value. With that in mind, it turns out, as the ikar time is schar mitzvah mitzvah, then surely the main motivation to run with enthusiasm to do a minor mitzvah is because of the intrinsic value of that mitzvah, schar mitzvah mitzvah. Was gibt zu verstehen, as die Ritze darf sein mitzvah der mitzvah gufa, which would motivate that I should be running to do the minor mitzvah because it is valuable. not only because it will bring to other valuable mitzvahs. Aber Freiheit leuten Pirush Rabbi Tanura, as mitzvah meint nicht des Schar von der Mitzvah zu welcher Rizrat. Not the Ritza Gufa, especially when you take the perspective of the Bar Tanura, who says the reward of the mitzvah refers to the running to do the mitzvah. That is already a mitzvah that deserves reward. So the primary concept of why you should run to do even a minor mitzvah is because every mitzvah is intrinsically valuable and the running itself is valuable. On the time mitzvah gereres mitzvah is a tam noisef, and then over and above that there's another value in running to do a mitzvah because it will be a catalyst for other mitzvahs. As in fall when the asvorish schar mitzvah vet nit polen even mention as a zol seiner rotzle mitzvah, which means let's say that I can't encourage a person to run to do a mitzvah by convincing them of the intrinsic value of the mitzvah, and they need something else to motivate them. So then we'll say, Zolle das tun, zu dem was in der Kim von der Mitzvah ist abhängig der Kim von noch Mitzvahs. Then we'll motivate that person by saying, okay, we'll run to do this mitzvah because the value it will bring to you is the performance of other mitzvahs in the future. Was im Vergleich zum Time von Schar Mitzvah ist das ein von Sheloi Lishma, which on a subtle level, if you're comparing this to a person who's running to do a mitzvah because they understand and appreciate the intrinsic value of the mitzvah, then if you're telling them run and do the mitzvah because it will bring you the opportunity for another mitzvah, that's not as pure an intention. It's a little bit self-interested. Von der mitzvah, but means this mitzvah I don't see as valuable in and of itself to the nth degree. I see it as an investment in future mitzvahs. But the primary, the best, the ideal state of why a person should run to do a mitzvah is because they appreciate the intrinsic value of that mitzvah. So if that is the case, why then does Ben Azai first quote the secondary motivation to do a mitzvah, because it will bring to other mitzvahs, before he quotes the primary reason to do a mitzvah, which is because the mitzvah is intrinsically valuable? So what are our questions? Why is he telling us specifically to run for a small mitzvah? Why doesn't he compare it to Bachamura? Why does he prioritize the reason because mitzvahs will grow other mitzvahs instead of telling us because the mitzvah is intrinsically valuable? Now, before we get to any of that, we're going to compare this to another lesson we have also in Pirkei Avos about running to do mitzvahs. Where is that? The Mishnah says in our Perek, in the next Pirkei, Yudum and Tema taught, have a rotz kitzvi, you should run like a deer. For what? To fulfill Hashem's will, which is pretty much mitzvahs. On Dihaira, now the lesson of Yehuda ben Tema, which is from Maseches Avos, at the Tur, is something that the Tur and Alter Rebbe in his second, so to speak, edited version of the Shulchan Aruch included, gestellt, als kloris v'seidus von Erechaim. They introduced this as the foundational principle of how a Jew should conduct their life. That's why it's at the beginning of the first element of Shulchan Aruch, which is called Erechaim, which is from Gan Shulchan Aruch, the introduction to the whole Shulchan Aruch. So with that in mind, we come to appreciate, as in Avodas Adam lekoinoi, that in the way that we serve the Eibishter, there are actually three different manifestations of running, which indicates enthusiasm for a mitzvah. Now, we haven't ever thought of putting all of these together, but now it emerges that there are actually three things, because we have Ben Azai saying running to the minor mitzvahs. We have Yehuda ben Tema saying run to do what the Eibishter wants, and we have already seen that there's a halacha that you have to run to shul v'chein l'shar mitzvahs. Same applies to all mitzvahs. So we're going to have to distinguish between the three. So Aleph, we have the mitzvos mitzvah. The first level is the level that is demanded of us, which is a requirement of the law, to run to do mitzvahs. On der din steht and that halacha is presented specifically in the context of running to shul and then expanded to apply to other mitzvahs. Now denoch is mitzvah, right? We expanded to include other mitzvahs. So that's entry level, that's black and white. Every single Jewish person has to do this. You have to run to do shul and other mitzvahs. Then, Beis, then you have the teaching of Yehuda ben Tema that we should always be enthusiastic and running to do what the Eibishter wants. That is no longer in halacha, nor midas chassidus. This is in Pirkei Avos, which is a more advanced manner of serving the Eibishter. It's something you should do. On the first status in Maseches Avos. That's why it's recorded in Pirkei Avos, not in Shulchan Aruch, even though it's brought as an introduction to Shulchan Aruch, as we'll see in a moment. So even though this is a higher manner of serving Hashem, it is something which is accessible to every single Jewish person and expected of every single Jewish person. That's why it appears in the Torah and in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, where we're addressing how every single Jewish person should position themselves and establish their ideology before they get started doing mitzvahs. Every Jew has to know that you should be enthusiastic to do what Hashem wants. That's level 2. This is not a specific halacha about shul or even about other mitzvahs. This is a mindset which takes us beyond just following the halacha. And then you have Ben Azai Gimel. The Hayro from Ben Azai v'rotzen mitzvah kala. Ben Azai adds a layer by saying you should run to do the minor mitzvahs. Now we're talking about something, number 1, which is midas chasidus. It's in Pirkei Avos, so that means that it's beyond the basic requirements of Judaism, and it's not something that everybody will experience equally. On the first state is nor in Avos. That's why it's not recorded in the Shulchan Aruch at all. It is only in Pirkei Avos. On the Chidush from the Ritze is mudgash in dem, was is most of heveratz in the mitzvah kalo. To understand this unique approach of enthusiasm and running to do a mitzvah, we have to take note of the fact that Ben Azai said it's specifically to a minor mitzvah. Now let's understand what this all means. The principle of a Jewish person being enthusiastically driven to do what Hashem wants, indicates that the person is joyous and interested to fulfill what the Eibishter wants and to cause nachas to Hashem. That's why you run, that's why you're enthusiastic, because you care about this and you feel it's really important and you love doing it and it gives you simcha. On Zirzes in an Eufen von Ritze is aber weiß, as the Simcha v'chayes is bei ihm l'mayla von seinem Medida v'hagbala. When a person's enthusiasm becomes so strong that they rush to perform a mitzvah, that tells you they have broken out of the rubric of normal behavior, of the things that make sense, of the things that effectively limit us. Was derfar schenkt sich an über sein Teva in Hilch Kiragil zu tun die Mitzvah was schneller. And you can see this because now the person is pushing themselves beyond ordinary behavior, which is, I have a schedule and I'll get there when I get there because I've got other things I have to take care of. And instead they're running to do what Hashem wants. It tells you that they've broken the normal rules of how they behave because they're so excited and enthusiastic and love doing what Hashem wants and giving Hashem nachas. So this amazing enthusiasm to go beyond the norm in order to do what Hashem wants, which is something that manifests in running, the only way a person will reach that point, that they are so enthusiastic, that they're literally rushing all the time to do what the Eibishter wants, means that they have submitted themselves to the Eibishter in an extraordinary way. That's why it's midas di chasidusa, and it's not something that is equal for all people. As long as a person is conscious of their own identity, their needs, their feelings, their understanding, and especially a person who takes themselves quite seriously and expects certain honor for themselves, and sees themselves as a great person, as the Rambam describes it, that kind of person can still be enthusiastic about doing mitzvahs, but the enthusiasm and joy around mitzvahs has to fit into a rational headspace, has to make sense. Which means that it has its limits. That's not somebody who's going to behave like what might appear to be crazy, running and rushing to do things. This person won't allow themselves to do things that are outside of their comfort zone. But when somebody has complete submission to Hashem, that initiates within that person unlimited simcha for what Hashem wants. And you'll see that simcha expressed in the fact that they rush with urgency to do what the Eibishter wants. To the extent, like the Rambam says, that the person's simcha will be so extreme that they'll actually compromise themselves and they'll actually almost embarrass themselves. Al derech wie wir find by David HaMelech, and the prime example of that obviously is David HaMelech at the time they're bringing the Aron to Yerushalayim. Where he's singing and spinning and making all kinds of, this whole show that even Michal, his wife, Bas Shol, she objected to it. The reason that David HaMelech was able to express such unrestrained dancing, simcha, expression of joy, enthusiasm for the Eibishter is because, as it says in the same perek, that David HaMelech said, but I'm nothing. I'm nobody. When he has to explain himself to Michal, so it's not about me, I'm nothing. I'm completely dedicated to the Eibishter, and therefore I don't care what people think. If they believe that I've kind of maybe overstepped the mark or lost myself in enthusiasm. I'm here for the Eibishter. That's what counts. Now, with this insight that the greater the bittul a person has, the greater their enthusiasm will be for Torah mitzvahs, and that will translate into an unrestrained simcha and this rushing around to do mitzvahs, that helps us to understand something which might appear difficult to understand in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. What does Alter Rebbe say? When the Alter Rebbe quotes the first level of running, which is a requirement for every single person, run to shul and by extension other mitzvahs. So bringt up the mokuf from wanneer we lent op dem din. So the Alter Rebbe quotes, as he often does, the source that teaches us this principle, which is the pasuk that says that we should chase after knowledge of Hashem. Now, what's difficult to understand about this is as follows: the lecheira, hafalpis is the derech von Alter Rebbe to meforshayim the time halachas. Even though it is common for the Alter Rebbe to give an explanation why a particular halacha is the way that it is aber nicht dem Mokum von jeder halacha. It is not common for the Alter Rebbe to quote the biblical source for a particular halacha. In fact, if you look at the majority of halachas, as the Alter Rebbe nicht die psukim von wanneer we lernen sie ab. The Alter Rebbe does not typically quote the psukim that teach us this particular halacha. Even in places where the Tur, which is of course one of the bases of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the Tur does bring those psukim, the Alter Rebbe often still does not. So mitzvos is understood in for mitzvah lorutz chulei. So what's unique about the mitzvah of running to shul and by extension other mitzvahs? Was da bringt and the makah from pasuk that the Alter Rebbe felt he had to tell us which pasuk we learn it from. Noch mehr to me is, and what makes this question even more extreme, was by dem din is I feel that the Tur nicht matik dem pasuk. The Tur, which is ostensibly the source of the Alter Rebbe in this case, does not quote the pasuk, even though the Tur often does. So why does the Alter Rebbe, even though the Alter Rebbe usually doesn't? And now the element that we have to understand about this, from the Mlashon in Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the language the Alter Rebbe uses, which is mitzvah lorutz l'beis hakneses, that there's a mitzvah to run to shul ve'chein l'chol dvar mitzvah, and likewise to all other mitzvahs. Shenemar, like the pasuk says, nirda faladas es Hashem, that we should chase after knowledge of Hashem. Kommt as von dem pasuk lernt man aus dem din von mitzvah lorutz sei l'beis hakneses und sei l'chol mitzvah. Now, the way the Alter Rebbe has worded it, it would sound like this pasuk is both the basis of the requirement to run to shul and the basis of the requirement to run to do every mitzvah. Is Tomor. Now that's odd, because in Gemara brings up the pasuk Nor ben Getzerutz leveis hakneses. The Gemara that does actually quote this pasuk only quotes it in the context of the mitzvah to run to shul. Aber ben Getzerutz ledvar mitzvah alocha brings a ander pasuk. But when it comes to bringing a source for the fact that we should be running to perform other mitzvahs, then the Gemara no longer refers to this pasuk. The pasuk brings a different pasuk, which is that you should follow after the Eibishter like a roaring lion. So why does the Alter Rebbe do this? Is the bir in them? The explanation is as follows: Mitten bringen den pasuk niedervolle das as Hashem. The fact that the Alter Rebbe quoted a pasuk that says we have to chase after the Eibishter is the Alter Rebbe nicht oisen zu bringen the mocker hadin. The Alter Rebbe's goal was not to tell us that's where in the Torah you will find the source for the halacha. No take dem ta'am fun der halacha. Instead, the Alter Rebbe was doing what he always does, which is to explain the reason why there's a mitzvah to run to shul and to other mitzvahs. Und der time of Klolis in Yoritz in Avodas Hashem, Sai leveis hakneses. Und Sai lechol dvar mitzvah is, what the Alter Rebbe is telling us is, the reason why a person should run to shul or to other mitzvahs is, nidafo ladas es Hashem, because there's a concept that we should be chasing after knowledge of Hashem. What does that mean? So to understand it better, we'll have a look at something that Tzemach Tzedek says. Wenn man das verstehen, laut dem Bir von Tzemach Tzedek auf dem Pasuk Hanal, v'neida nirdafa l'das es Hashem. So the Tzemach Tzedek points out that the full version of this Pasuk has the word das, knowledge, in it twice. It starts with v'neida, we should know, to chase, ladas, to know Hashem. Der Chayr of Avos chazet ibet dem Pasuk dominion adas zweimal v'neida un ladas, asks that Tzemach Tzedek, why does the Pasuk repeat the same principle, which is knowledge of Hashem, in two different words in the same Pasuk? Is that Tzemach Tzedek mevaer, so that Tzemach Tzedek explains based on a principle that we know quite well from Chassidus, as die zwei lashonos anim ramas if die zwei deos, that the two references to das, knowledge, refer to the two experiences of knowledge that exist based on the pasuk dekel deos havaya, that the Eibishter is a God of knowledges, which refers to das tachton and das elyon, a lower and a higher knowledge. Und der Avoide in an Eufen von Nirde Favoritzen nimmt sich Dafka mitzad la das es Hashem das elyon. Says that Tzemach Tzedek, this pasuk is illustrating to us that when a person has that degree of enthusiasm, that they're running and they're rushing and they can't get there quickly enough to do what the Eibishter wants, that tells us that somebody is in touch with das elyon, the more supernal perspective of knowledge. Mitzad das tachtoin, as long as a person is locked into the lower, more limited knowledge of Hashem. The day of us wird erhört in Tachten Welt, which means consciousness of Hashem that is part and parcel of the reality of our world. Then, as Welt is ayeshu metzius, was der eine leki is mahava mechaya. Then the perspective is the world exists thanks to the fact that the Eibishter allows it to exist. But it exists. So I acknowledge that the Eibishter is the source of all life and all existence, but I also acknowledge that the world is kind of real. With that attitude, my approach to Judaism is going to be very measured and very step by step. It will have its limitations where you can only progress one step at a time. But if a person is keyed in to supernal wisdom and insight, then you recognize that the only thing that's real is Eibishter. And the world, not only the world, but even all of the energy that is required in order for the world to exist, all of that is Ainu Klok Shivi. That's nothing. It's not real. It doesn't actually exist. Only the Eibishter is real. That promotes within the person's Avodas Hashem this tremendous rush and urgency. Von Rotzoi, this amazing yearning for Hashem, to escape the limitations of who I am and how I think and what I believe the process should be, and instead to say, let me be absolutely dedicated and rush to do what the Eibishter wants. Now, was is von Medide v'Agbola, nimmt sich dafke mitzad dem Bittul von Menschen. So now what do we know? What we know is that in order for a person to reach this state of complete excitement, to do what the Eibishter wants, which is going to translate into rushing around to fulfill as many mitzvahs as possible, that derives from the fact that the person submits to the Eibishter and recognizes that there's only Eibishter, that's all that counts. Was is Hecher from Medide v'Agbola, nimmt sich dafke mitzad bis zum Bittul von das Elyon und das es Hashem, and as we've just identified, the type of Bittul we're describing is Bittul that allows a person to lock in to Das Elyon, which is a perspective that above is real, below is not. My world is iron, actually. Sagt aber der Shulchan Psak din hashav l'chol nefesh as mitzvah loretz beis hakneses v'chein l'chol dvar mitzvah. So despite the fact that in order to reach this tremendous enthusiasm for doing what the Eibishter wants, a person needs absolute bittul, still, the Shulchan Aruch gives a basic type of urgency and enthusiasm for Judaism that every Jew has to fulfill, and that is running to shul and likewise to other mitzvahs. In other words, warum? Let's say that a person is not yet at this level of complete awareness of Hashem that overwhelms them with enthusiasm to do what Hashem wants. And because the person is not yet at that level, their enthusiasm around the mitzvah is quite tempered. Says the Shulchan Aruch, okay, so maybe your soul is not rushing and gushing to serve Hashem, but your legs, the physical part of you, the part that you can easily control, needs to actually still rush to do what Hashem wants. In other words, practically you got to do it. So we could debate whether every Jew is at a level that they could handle the full-blown bittul and commitment to Hashem and the enthusiasm that comes with it. But there is no debate that every Jew is capable of getting up and actually doing it. Even a person who hasn't even gotten to the level of das tachten. Fact is, tell a person run to shul, they could run to shul. Tell a person run to do a mitzvah, they could run to do a mitzvah. Like we find in various mitzvahs, as der von Kiyum mitzvah is ausgestellt behessen zu dem Teichen Pnimi von der mitzvah. The way in which we perform the mitzvah is designed to match what the deeper motivation behind the mitzvah is. On jeder afil der was halt noch nicht bei der Teichen Pnimi von der mitzvah, and therefore, even a person who doesn't begin to understand the deeper meaning behind the mitzvah, und es kann sein, als weiß afil nicht von dem, could be that he's not even aware that there's such a concept as a deeper meaning. Dafas tonloid dem eifan dafka still has to do the mitzvah in that particular way. So in other words, if I don't understand what the significance is of 7 times wrapping my tefillin strap around my arm, I still have to do 7 times around my arm. So even if a person doesn't really fully experience and engage with this bittul to Hashem and das elyon and complete enthusiasm to ratz the mitzvah kala, still, practically, when it comes to do a mitzvah, I have to actually physically move quickly. Al derech, wie wir finden bei der Mitzvah von Krishma, sie kommt nach Psuke de Zimra Brichas Krishma. Here's another example. In order to say Shema, there's a whole prelude. You got to say Psuke de Zimra, you got to say the brachas before the Shema. Why do we have that? Warum gedei zu zukommen in Krishma zum Herrgos gedei von Hashem Echad? Because in order for a person to reach a proper state of acknowledgement that the Eibishter is one, as the Gemara tells us, where we accept Hashem as the absolute authority over the heavens, the earth, and all 4 directions of this earth. And so Avos Hashem, and the objective then is to reach a point of real, tangible love of God, which affects our heart, soul, and all of our might. To get there, to get there, we have to have all the meditation and contemplation that belongs in those earlier parts of the davening. Psuke de Zimra, meditating on Hashem's creation, Brichas Krishma, meditating on the reality of the angels. Aber von deswegen is der Seidon gesagt für jeden. Now, whether a person has that deep meditation or not, every one of us has to go through those steps. Even if we're nowhere near understanding, appreciating, contemplating what any of these things are, go ahead and do it. That's how we daven. Let's understand a little bit better why it is that every single Jewish person, even if they're not really there in spiritual terms, has to physically run in order to do a mitzvah. Even if the person is completely out of touch with the deeper meaning of the mitzvah, because if a person trains themselves to always run to do a mitzvah with a sense of joy and anticipation, that bringt das Guffe dazu, that will help the person get to that stage where they'll actually start to live it and feel it. When you start, yes, albeit externally, going through motions, it eventually gets the person on board. When we do something, it eventually affects how we feel, and we will start to have the genuine simcha and enthusiasm to do what the Eibishter wants. Which is actually what the pasuk is saying, that we'll chase to knowledge of Hashem. Was meint bepashtus? Nicht dass nirdefoy zatetzom subu von das Hashem. The pasuk is not only telling us that when you know and understand about the Eibishter, then you'll become enthusiastic. No, fakert, the pasuk says it the other way around. As the nirdefoy bringt zu das Hashem, that chasing, physically getting ourselves into the habit of running with enthusiasm to do what the Eibishter wants, that's going to actually activate that enthusiasm within us. Because starting with the practical, which is to go with enthusiasm and run to do a mitzvah, eventually rubs off on us, and we start to have this bittul and acceptance of das elyon, that there's nothing more valuable than the Eibishter. This will also help us to understand why it is that when the halacha tells us that every single one of us has to run to do mitzvahs, the primary example it uses is shul, which is obviously a place of davening. Because tefillah is avodah shebelev. Tefillah is how we serve the Eibishter using our heart. Was in Yone is, as Aide is sich misdabek zum Eibishten, auf zuzukommen zu hechere Darges in Avodas Hashem. Davening actually means not as everybody believes that it's just a matter of simple please and thank you. The objective of davening is for a person to get to the point where they are connected to Hashem, and therefore they upgrade their behavior and their service of Hashem. Und der verhäupt sich an die Avoide von Niederfor, was bringt das Hashem das Elin mit der Ritzel Avoide Satvila. So therefore, if a person hopes to reach das Elin, a person hopes to have this tremendous awareness of Hashem, which will translate into incredible enthusiasm for Hashem, where will we start? Where's the training ground? During davening, because the whole objective of davening is to get us to attachment to Hashem. Weil sie is die Avoide Miuchedes zu der Griechen, die hechere Dag von das ist Hashem. And the reason for this is quite simple, because that's the goal of davening. Davening is to get us to a point of da'as, where we actually know the Eibishter in a very meaningful way. Und von und durch die Avodas HaTfilah wird aufgetan, die Avoide von Niederfor Veritza bei Kol Dvar Mitzvah. And when our davening starts to achieve what it is meant to, and we improve and mature our appreciation of Hashem through our davening, that's going to spill over into all the other mitzvahs. And so that's why it's v'chein l'chol dvar mitzvah, that if we get it right with davening, it's going to translate into other mitzvahs as well. Das ist der Auftuf von der Herois von Havirotz Chulav Ashteinem Sechte Avos auf dem Din Anal Sheba Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so now we understand what's going on over here. The Shulchan Aruch is telling us, train ourselves, that we should make a point of running to do mitzvahs, particularly davening, because davening is the catalyst for real appreciation of Hashem, and that will eventually translate into feeling that enthusiasm and feeling that bittul to Hashem. Now we can understand what Ben Azai is teaching us over and above that. Right? Dafke and Pirkei Avos. What Ben Azai is describing is the deeper motivation behind the practical running to do a mitzvah. The concept of this unrelenting, tremendous enthusiasm and simcha to do what the Eibishter wants is an avoida gedola milsa de chasidusa, which of course is a very advanced way of serving Hashem, and that's why it belongs in Pirkei Avos, which is speaking about more advanced ways of serving Hashem. Now, in dem Gufa sein in dort zwei Yifanim, but even that has two parts to it. Okay, so there's the practical part that Shulchan Aruch talks about, which is just go with enthusiasm, even if you're not feeling it. To achieve meaningful simcha, unlimited simcha of Hashem, there's two steps to that, both described in Pirkei Avos. You have Yehuda ben Taima's teaching, which is you should always run to do what the Eibishter wants. That's a lesson that applies to every single Jewish person. On the Farvet is gebracht euch in Torah and Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch Kenal, and as we've mentioned, that's why it's also included in books of Halacha, the Torah and Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Then beyond that, based the Heira from Ben Azai, then you have Ben Azai's lesson, which is Haveirotz the mitzvah kala v'asid nitcha v'chol nefesh, that you should run with enthusiasm even to a minor mitzvah. That's something which does not necessarily apply across the board to every person. How so? What's the distinction? The bir in them. Let's understand it. Yehuda ben Taima Yehuda ben Taima is not talking about the specific running and enthusiasm associated with specific performance of mitzvahs. Rather, Yehuda ben Taima he's addressing the position that we're supposed to assume at the beginning of the day, which is basically get our head right at the beginning of the day for the entire day. Yehuda ben Taima is talking about what happens when you wake up in the morning before you get into the nitty-gritty of the actual things you're going to do during the course of the day. It's like saying Moidani, which you're supposed to do the second you wake up. That is a generalized acknowledgement of Hashem's authority and gratitude for the fact that we have an neshama. And therefore, it is a general dedication to the Eibishter for the whole day. That's what Moidani is. I'm here in your service. And therefore, because of that, that's why Yehuda ben Taima is talking over here about a positioning attitude at the beginning of the day. So he doesn't incorporate the word mitzvah. He doesn't say run to a mitzvah, because we're not at that level yet. He uses a much more generic expression, run to do what the Eibishter wants. Doing what the Eibishter wants is the underpinning of all of the details of the various things and the various mitzvahs that we're going to perform during the course of the day. Basic, and das ist gestellt geworden in Anhub von ganz Shulchan Aruch. For exactly this reason, Yehuda ben Taima's statement is included at the beginning of the entire Shulchan Aruch. Und noch mehr, noch vor dem Inyan von Amiras Moedani. Fascinating, but this is introduced in the Shulchan Aruch even before the halacha about saying Moedani. Why? Weil die Mesira und Esina zu Avodas Hashem, was Yehuda ben Taima is oisem mit seiner Hirah, because the level of dedication that Yehuda ben Taima is expecting of us in this lesson is Amer Klolistika Hidah Mesira and Esina. I feel mer von der Hidah von Moedani is something which is even broader and more fundamental than even Moedani, which is the beginning of the whole attitude to the entire day. Und die Seres Klolis Avodas Hashem is shaykh zu jeder Id. Now every single Jew is capable of getting into this headspace at the beginning of the day. In Vasar Matzav soll no sein. Doesn't matter who you are, where you are. But from Amiras Moedani, as we know very well about the nature of Moedani, the famous Hayom Yom, as a tam pnimi, was man sagt, es far negelwasser, Philip Yodain to Meos. The reason why we say Moedani before washing our hands, and even if the hands are known to be impure, is because every tumah in the world cannot contaminate that foundational attitude of a Jewish person, Moedani. A person could be lacking in one area or another, but the Moedani bleibt ganz, but his Moedani remains rock solid. And that's why every single Jewish person is capable of this. Every single Jewish person is capable of getting into the headspace which says, I am enthusiastic to do what the Eibishter wants. Details to follow. Over that, Ben Azai introduces another much more advanced layer of serving the Eibishter, which is to run to the minor mitzvah and flee the Avera. What Ben Azai is saying is, let's not only talk about the general attitudes that you're supposed to have, let's talk about the specific mitzvah that you're doing. Well, you may not be focused on the generic perspective or intention of every single mitzvah, which applies equally to all mitzvahs, that the Eibishter sanctified us and instructed us with his mitzvahs, that we should do what the Eibishter wants. Now, but now you're engaged with a particular mitzvah, so you're thinking about the value of that particular mitzvah and the achievement of that particular mitzvah. Which is why you could assess this particular mitzvah as being minor, because you're focused on the details. So Ben Azai says, well, even when you're analyzing this particular mitzvah you're about to do, and you conclude that it is a minor mitzvah, your behavior should still be with absolute joy and with absolute chayas that has no restraint. Now, wie montes Ben Azai bei Aiden? So how does Ben Azai have this expectation of us? As the Teichim proti von a mitzvah, that the detailed elements of a mitzvah, which surely is very limited because it's this specific mitzvah with its particular rules. So how could something which is so specific generate such an overarching enthusiasm and joy? So the answer to that is you have to know who Ben Azai is. If you appreciate Ben Azai, you appreciate his attitude. Is a Safara, was das given Ben Azai san Hoge Bichlal, this is how Ben Azai behaved. Hat sich gekocht in der Tnur von Ratzai Reisgem vom Welt. Ben Azai's entire approach to Judaism was this yearning for the Eibishter that sucks you out of the here and now to attach yourself to something far higher. Hat sich gekocht in der Tnur von Ratzai Reisgem vom Welt. Was der Fall, hat sich nicht given Bepiri Verivia, that's why Ben Azai didn't have children. He didn't get married. Because his argument was, what should I do? I'm so caught up and I have such a thirst for Torah. I don't have the opportunity and time to sit down and establish a family. Eventually, it reached an extreme. As ein Knisse the Paradise is given an ofen von Heitzitz Vameis, that when he joined Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues, and they went into this spiritual experience of paradise, he glimpsed what was going on over there, and his neshama left his body. Ratzei onashuv. It's this tremendous yearning for godliness that doesn't know how to translate back into practicality. Dugmas misas shnei bnei Aaron, which is similar to what happened to Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, that they were also sucked up into this higher reality because they had such a tremendous yearning for Hashem. So therefore, when you have somebody like Ben Azai who is so drawn to Hashem in such a powerful way, even when it comes to practically doing mitzvahs, the way he does a mitzvah is in this extreme way. In every mitzvah he feels, as the Rechaim describes, the sons of Aaron felt, this incredible beauty and sweetness. Was ist da in mitzvahs? Was das ruft der Reis haritza v'simchen kema mitzvahs ba'ifem bilti modadung mugbal. The mitzvah is so beautiful that it generates this intense, unlimited joy and enthusiasm around the mitzvah because it's just so beautiful. Such a powerful and dynamic enthusiasm for mitzvah goes even beyond what his nefesh elikis would have expected. Und der Mitzvah vereinfacht, was da passt nicht der Lashon Haverotz mitzvah kala kibachamura. That's why when Ben Azai is describing this, he's not going to say run towards this minor mitzvah like a major mitzvah. Weil die Ne'imos von mitzvahs, because the beauty of the mitzvah, was ruft arois die Ritzele mitzvahs, which is what cultivates and sparks this incredible enthusiasm for the mitzvah, is mitzadem techen proti shebechol mitzvah, is something that the Ben Azai saw in the value of the specific mitzvah, whichever mitzvah it might have been. And therefore, the geschmack of a minor mitzvah is not as extreme as the geschmack of a major mitzvah, so the chayas is not as pronounced as in a major mitzvah. So he can't say that a minor mitzvah will be the same as a major mitzvah. In fact, Ben Azai's greatest insight over here is the fact that you can have enthusiasm for a minor mitzvah. As I feel a mitzvah kala is do a neimus bilti mugbeles, because he's identifying for us that even a mitzvah which is a minor mitzvah has infinite beauty associated with it. Which is why you have to have enthusiasm even for the minor mitzvah. In der Herren die Teilkeit der Nemos von Mitzvahs kennen sein zwei Eufanim. Now, the fact that you could identify and experience this beauty of a mitzvah, that could also manifest in two ways. One way is one way is the mitzvah is objectively and intrinsically valuable. Kirvas elikim toiv. Anything which is close to the Eibishter is good. Or a lower level, was nafshoy hoilikis vet von dem haben kirvas elikim li toiv. Or there's the possibility where the person says that mitzvah is going to add so much value to me, so it's good for me. Und da sind die zwei Teile, was Ben Azai sagt. That is the deeper meaning of the two reasons why Ben Azai tells us that we should be running to mitzvahs. Why we should be running to a mitzvah? Mitzvah, one reason he gives is because a mitzvah will lead to another mitzvah. And the second reason he gives is because the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah. Atamo ikri, what's the main reason? The greatest beauty in the mitzvah is the fact that the mitzvah will bring another mitzvah. The goydel aneimus of a mitzvah is das was is gereres mitzvah. Sie bringt them tzavs of a chiv von mit neibischen. The first and highest and most advanced level of beauty and pleasure in a mitzvah is the pleasure that the mitzvah brings. Mitzvah, it brings connection to Hashem. That's the greatest beauty that you could possibly have. So that's the ultimate state. But because Ben Azai is also addressing people who are not at the ultimate level, where the value of the mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. He's even talking to people who are just starting out in their avodas Hashem. Which is a person who's only doing what the Eibishter wants in a way that the person relates to, talks to me. Is it the Rebbe Moisef mitzvah? To that person, the Ben Azai tells there's another level, and that is that there's a reward of the mitzvah, which is the mitzvah. Even the so-called reward of a mitzvah. Was schar is a Sache, was der Adam fühlt, als hat von dem verdient. Schar means something that I feel that I benefited from it. Is a mitzvah. Was aber heftig mit dem Eibishter, the fact that you now have a connection to the Eibishter. In other words, schar mitzvah gereres mitzvah means the value of the mitzvah is there'll be another mitzvah in the world. There'll be more connection in the world. Schar mitzvah means the value of the mitzvah is you will feel a connection to Hashem. As I felt an imas built in mukbeles, that gives this person this tremendous geschmack. Och yodubin in schar mitzvah bahai al meleko. as we well know, when the Gemara tells us that there are no real rewards for mitzvahs in this world, that's because the reward of mitzvahs are infinite and our world is finite. And therefore Ben Azai has a message. Even a person who's living in order to get feedback, in order to get a feeling, in order to get a connection, and that's what motivates the Torah mitzvahs. Don't worry, you'll get it. And therefore you should be enthusiastic about your mitzvah observance as well.